Liminal spaces, a concept that was introduced to the wider public consciousness via a 2019 4chan post of what became known as the backrooms. An image of a hallway that somehow everyone feels like they've seen before. The picture is covered in a yellow wash, indicative of not only the 90s era that this style of decoration came from, but also of the aging of the walls, the carpet, and the ceiling tiles. Whether this reminds you of that old YMCA that you went to as a kid, or an office building that you used to frequent, or a current place that you go to that hasn't been renovated in decades. Somehow, some way, this reminds you of somewhere that you've been, but at the same time, you haven't been there before. This became known as the backrooms, as a reference to video game culture. The idea here is this location is somewhere you can only reach by phasing through the ground, referred to as no clipping in reference to a common video game cheat, and in doing so you accidentally become teleported to this space as a result of having nowhere else for this game to place you. This internet phenomenon propelled the already growing space of analog horror, a style of found footage horror built around analog technology of the 60s to 90s, into even further popularity with the series of short films from Kane Pixel uploaded to YouTube starting in 2022. Arguably, the culmination of all of this is what caused liminal spaces as an aesthetic to even become an internet phenomenon in the first place, with subreddits, Twitter gimmick accounts, YouTube channels, and more just dedicated to the backrooms or liminal spaces generally. However, what many people are likely not aware of is that liminal spaces and liminality do not exist purely in the physical world. The idea of the liminal was first developed by Arnold van Gennep in his book Rites of Passage in the early 1900s, and it was further then developed by Victor Turner in the 1960s. The liminal is something in transition. It can be an object, a person, a space, anything really. It's like the peak of a roller coaster ride, where you're not currently climbing to the top, but you're also not rapidly descending yet. It is the anticipation of what is to come and the loss of what was. It can be as mundane as a doorway, the transition between two rooms, or it can be as complex as a job change, moving across the country, or a literal rite of passage in a ritualistic sense. This is what liminality really means. And to be in a liminal space can mean a literal space or a metaphorical one. My interest in liminal spaces began when I took a class during my bachelor's in psychology about how psychedelics were being researched in the field of psychology and the impact they had in terms of discussions about consciousness. That semester, I also had a class about parapsychology, which is research into unexplainable or difficult to explain psi phenomenon within psychology. Things from hypnosis to telekinesis to near-death experiences and more. Both of these probably sound quite out there for a bachelor's in science program, but they both really came back to the idea of consciousness. We asked questions like, what is consciousness? Where does consciousness exist? What theories have been presented in regards to consciousness? What do our lived experiences say about these conceptualizations of consciousness? And as a part of these ongoing conversations, the idea of liminality came up, particularly in relation to hypnagogia, which is the transition between being awake and being asleep, or the transition between consciousness and unconsciousness. Or to say it in another way, hypnagogia is the liminal space of consciousness. And this space is where we can gather a lot of knowledge about consciousness. Meditation is a way of accessing this liminal space consistently, and we know a lot about how meditation is incredibly helpful for people's mental health, as it allows us a way to process things in our lives. In recent research, we have found that psychedelics allow us to access this liminal space in a controlled way that allows trained psychologists to help people with conditions like PTSD to process their traumatic experiences. This shows the power of liminal spaces. In the sense of humans being in a transitionary period, we have perspective of both the past, the present, and the future, all simultaneously, and this is a powerful place to be in, albeit it can also be incredibly scary. This translates directly to physical liminal spaces. A part of the interest from the internet is the simultaneous comfort and discomfort of liminal spaces. On one hand, these seem like places that we've all been before, reminiscent of places from our childhood potentially. On the other hand, something is off. We haven't actually been here, and typically these are places that are expected to be populated, but we're alone. This is where the horror aspect is able to be so successful. By already having a setting that is comfortable and uncomfortable, there's a natural amount of tension that exists in these spaces. So storytellers are able to accentuate this tension by adding elements that slowly make the viewer more and more uncomfortable until there is an inevitable payoff. A great example of this is in this Cane Pixel video, where we watch from the first-person perspective someone wandering the backrooms. At some point, they are chased by a creature and they have to hide. We then cut to them exploring more and more of the backrooms. We're also being shown more and more unsettling areas, and that uncomfortableness compounds upon itself, adding to the tension. This leads to one of the most interesting settings for horror I've seen in a while as a horror fan. Adding on to this, the world that Cane Pixel has been building around this setting over a series of videos to build the lore of his version of this world, and you have an incredible series that's worth your time. Another similar utilization of liminal spaces from recent internet culture is myhouse.wad. myhouse.wad is a Doom 2 map that at first seems like someone modeled their house into a Doom map and they just called it a day. But as you learn more and more about not only the map, but about how it was made, you see that this map utilizes liminal spaces in more ways than you would expect. First, massive spoilers for the map. If you're interested in playing it, do so. If you want to learn about it separately from me explaining some minor pieces of it, go watch this great video that explains the map just inside and out at great detail. With that out of the way, when entering the house for the first time, you're faced with some enemies in the living room and a stairway that goes downstairs. Something that's not obvious to us non-Doom players is that this is an impossible feat in Doom. You cannot have multi-floored maps where a floor exists above the floor below it. The way that this exists is by teleporting the player between segments of the map at specific locations to give the illusion of a multi-floored map. This itself provides a sort of liminal space. There's always a point as where you approach this teleportation area, you essentially exist between two floors of a map. Practically, yes, you teleport instantly to the new floor, but to the player, you're unaware of this function, unless you're paying very close attention. And so, this puts the player in a liminal space between floors as they move from one to another. This may seem insignificant until you've played more and more of the game, and you start to notice things changing when transitioning between floors. All of a sudden, it becomes painfully obvious that as you go from one floor to another, things are changing. And this adds tension as you cross the plane between floors. You begin to ask, what will change? What was there previously in the first place? What will become of where I just was? Was there always an Xbox by the TV? Where did the orb outside go? Where did the windows go? More and more tension as things become familiarly unfamiliar. You know what the house layout is supposed to be, but things are just not quite right. The utilization of liminal spaces exists narratively as well. Outside of the map itself is a story about a friend and his family. They have to eventually move on from this house. The house exists as a vessel for hopes, dreams, nightmares. And eventually you'll run across liminal spaces in the backroom sense. An apartment building surrounded by windows, an empty swimming pool, a vacant airport, a strange staircase, a structure in the clouds, dark hallways, and an abandoned gas station. These all compound to not only serve the narrative of the map, both in-game and the alternate reality game outside of Doom, but also to just set the atmosphere for the game. While the Backrooms and myhouse.wad are both incredible pieces of media, what really got me thinking about liminal spaces recently is a game called Pseudo-Regalia. Pseudo-Regalia is a Metroidvania where you play as a bunny named Sybil, who, for whatever reason I can't remember, is put into this world where you need to collect a series of power-ups to reach a final boss. It has an incredible movement system that only improves as you continue to obtain the upgrades and get to do more cool stuff. But what really made me fall in love with this game is the setting. The atmosphere is very clearly heavily inspired by PlayStation 1 era games with a very simple and polygonal aesthetic, and as a result, it looks almost liminal. The heavy fog, washed out colors, and blurry textures help to create a dreamlike aesthetic. Now, spoilers for Pseudo-Regalia if you care, the game does in fact take place within a dream. So it's unsurprising that this game evokes these tones through its art and even in its music. Hell, the first track that plays when you open the game is called Remnants of the Dream. There's even a track titled Paramnesiac, which itself is a psychological phenomenon where an individual is unable to distinguish between real and fantasy memories, like deja vu. This is fascinating because liminal spaces themselves are paramnesiac. Many people describe them as being places which they've been to before, or they really feel like they've been to before. They feel a sense of deja vu. Something about this game, from the moment I saw a clip on Twitter, called to me. I knew that this was a game I had to play, and once I picked it up, I couldn't put it down until I had completed the game some 4 hours later. This was what helped me really realize my fascination with liminal spaces. A couple of months after I played Pseudoregalia for the first time, I went with some friends to see a band in concert called Scorn. Now, they're a fantastic band that I highly recommend, but what has stuck with me since that concert is one of the opening bands called MS Paint. They're a hardcore band that fuses hardcore with genres like rap and punk. And despite what it might sound like, they don't have a guitarist. They use a synthesizer as their primary melodic instrument, and goddamn, Nick Piniella can make those keys sing. Backing the synth is an incredibly grimy sounding bass guitar from Randy Riley and driving drums from Quinn Mackey. All these top off with the poetic lyrics sung by Dee Dee. When MS Paint first started performing that night at Aisle 5, almost immediately Liam and I made eye contact and simultaneously agreed, holy shit, those keys. I can honestly say I've never heard anything like MS Paint before in my life, and I've been obsessed since. But as is the theme with this video, even though I can say I've never heard anything like them, there's something oddly familiar about it all. While the energy in most of their songs is decidedly too fast-paced for it to fit in with the quiet uncomfortableness of the aesthetic of liminal spaces, I can't help but feel like the melodies of songs like Titan of Hope or Flowers from Concrete are just perfect for the spaces of something like Pseudoregalia or any similarly styled PlayStation 1 era game. This feeling is only amplified by a swelling of existentialism I feel when I imagine myself in a liminal space, surrounded by nothing but my thoughts and an uncanny valley of space and time. When considering this space and the lyrics of MS Paint's first project, Post American, the words ring true to my soul in a way I've never felt before. Poetry never really made sense to me until I heard the words, inherit death like a birthright, or free from the sun. I feel like I'll be born again in the dirt. These words are deeply existential, bringing to the front thoughts of death and reincarnation, a desire to be reunited with the world and a society that inexorably separates us from our ancestral ties to the earth we walk upon. While there are not many lyrics to this album, each one sits in my soul and both makes me question my place on earth, my existence, but also fills me with a desire to be a positive influence on the world and those around me. This music has so deeply resonated with me that it drives me to do the same, in the hope I too can create something that resonates with someone else and motivates them to continue on in the face of a world that will inevitably lead to the outcome detailed in Post American. Why does this aesthetic bring up such existential questions? I'd like to think it's not just me that sees a connection between liminality and existentialism. Surely, whether it's intentional or not in MS Paint's music, there's a tie between the soundscape and the topics discussed in their music. I see liminal spaces in the cultural aesthetic as being liminal not because they're meant to be some video game space that wasn't supposed to be accessed by a player, but because these spaces exist in a point in time defined by the picture itself. This old swimming pool doesn't exist anymore. The physical location may still exist, but the aesthetic is gone. Society has moved on from these designs. The photo allows us to travel back in time to the liminal space in which the photo was taken, a point that exists between when the location was built and when it was inevitably taken apart. Nothing on this planet will exist forever, and thus every photo is a liminal point that shows what is essentially the transitional point between the past, the present when the photo is taken, and the future. I mentioned earlier that a liminal space can be something as simple as a doorway. And what are photos if not doorways that lead us back to where we were, or the photographer was, when the photo was taken? So many feelings and emotions can be conveyed through a photo. They aren't simply capturing the colors and shapes of that moment, but also the energy around it. There is more meaning there that we can experience than just the light rays that bounce off of a photo into our eyes. There are stories about what happened around that picture and what came to pass after. Liminal spaces are inherently existential, and I believe a large aspect of the recent interest in them from the current zeitgeist is in the existentialism that is within liminal spaces. I'm 24, I've got a graduate degree working on a PhD, I have friends that are married, engaged, buying homes, having kids, finding where they fit in the world, and I'm trying to do the same as well. This is a normal experience. What feels abnormal is the tumultuous time that we exist in. There are tragedies happening all over the world, our planet is dying, and it feels like there's nothing we can really do about it. This is how it's always been though. This experience isn't unique. The world is always changing, there are always wars, there's always death. These are ever present. And in a weird way, that's comforting. These experiences aren't anything new, and life will move forward despite how hard everything may be. Bite down baring teeth. Look with love in your heart. It takes compassion, wax poetic. Burns my tongue when you speak. Not a shroud of doubt. Just the will to keep living, whole world watching as time keeps on ticking. Your spirit is true, confident that you're gonna break through. The 90s to 2000s aesthetic is a reflection of existential questioning and change, as it itself exists in the transitional period between the pre-Internet of Things era and the post-Internet of Things era. As the internet grew and technology improved, we quickly jumped from simple text on computer screens to websites transmitted across the world. We moved from 2D graphics on the SNES to 3D on the N64. But we didn't stay there for long. The modern interest in PlayStation 1 and N64 era graphics isn't just from people remembering playing these styles of games when they were younger. It additionally comes from the unique point that these systems were placed in. This was the first step in 3D graphics. While still highly limited by modern standards, these were groundbreaking pieces of technology. The gap from 2D to 3D was massive, and the gap from the early 3D of the N64 to the 3D of the GameCube is also massive. But that is the point where graphics started to have significantly diminishing returns. This leads to early 3D having very distinct visual styles as developers still figuring out how to make games in 3D and how to make them look good. There is a piece of early 3D art that is existential as well. How do I recreate a world in this new environment? What of my previous art skills can I still use in this new medium? What does it mean to exist in a three-dimensional space? I didn't grow up with an N64 or a PlayStation 1, but I don't go around looking for games in the graphical style of the GameCube, the PlayStation 3, or the Wii. I love the aesthetic of the N64 and PlayStation 1 games because of their technical limitations, because of how the challenges behind those original undertakings of 3D shaped the visual language of early 3D graphic. In some way, I believe it was meant to be. The transition between the old digital and modern digital led to challenges in the development of games as they transitioned the medium entirely from 2D to 3D. This liminal space led to the design of graphical aesthetics that are indicative of that era, which in turn are now once again being related to the concept of liminality. Between the different art forms like games and the music of MS Paint, there's almost a cosmic relationship between the aesthetic of liminality and the function of liminality. Liminal spaces in an aesthetic sense, like the backrooms or old computer graphics or hardcore music, are themselves representative of points of transition. The backrooms are spaces that are themselves undergoing a transition. The empty office space, the crowdless pool, and the abandoned apartment complex. These are places that are absent of the very thing that defines them, absent of people. The only explanation being that these are places that are currently transitioning from what was to what will be. This iconic image, the originator of the concept of the backrooms, is reminiscent of an office space, now empty, abandoned, forgotten. The only reminder we have of it is this image, a moment in time saved forever. These old graphics are indicative of a time where artists were just learning to move from one medium to another. They can be awkward, unrefined, and they can be uncanny. We know what they're trying to represent: an Italian man, a humanoid bunny, a tree, but they don't quite match what we know these things should look like. They exist in a point between refined 2D and refined 3D. That doesn't mean that they're bad or wrong. It's merely an explanation for this point of limbo. These visual aesthetics can end up leaving us with a sense of slight discomfort as graphics reach a sort of uncanny valley. When you look at 2D Mario, you know that Mario is not real. He is not a real person as he is a 2D image. However, when we look at Mario in 3D, there begins to be a sort of uncanny valley where Mario has begun to look more like a real person, but he clearly is not. He is now 3D, similar to a person, but yet his face is polygonal, absent of detail, and with no emotion. This uncanniness typically comes off as quaint or cute or silly, much like how Sonic's emotional expression in Sonic Adventure would be much more likely to evoke a laugh than disgust, but fundamentally, these are imperfect replicas of the real world that have stepped too far away from unreal, but not close enough to real. It's not too unlike wearing a mask. A mask is sort of a liminal transition between someone's real face and the face of another person or thing. When a mask attempts to mimic another person, it is creepy if done poorly. It's why the Mike Myers mask is scary. If we look at a mask that is incredibly close to the real thing, it is significantly less weird, as we have crossed the uncanny valley. And then of course there's a point where we haven't even attempted to cross the valley. We made a silly mask, one that is something that is not real, or is a caricature of something real. This is analogous to what liminal spaces are. By being at a point between the past and the present, liminal spaces sit in a sort of uncanny valley, which leads us to be uncomfortable. And to me, this is the beauty of these spaces. By putting us into a state of discomfort, we are challenged, but not too challenged as to not have agency. This is where I find the beauty in MS Paint's Post-American. The soundscape to me has the auditory effect that Backrooms has visually. The whine of the keys, the driving of the drums, the grounding bass. It is off-putting, but yet pushes forward, uncomfortable but challenging us. This is paired with the lyrics that create this beautiful cocktail of melancholy acknowledgement of reality, but also the inspiration to persevere. The message of Post-American is one of hope. It does not resign itself to the harsh reality that we live within. It instead looks forward to when we will once again be reunited with the cycle of life, when we will witness the downfall of oppressors, when we will finally receive our inheritance of death. It is not afraid, but it looks forward knowing that all of this suffering will one day come to an end, and in the meantime maintains a mindset of hope and inspiration. The track list of this album tells a story, from Information and Acid to Titan of Hope and Flowers from Concrete. There is an acknowledgement of the pain in our world, but not in a disparaging way. Why don't you just say, you tend to isolate? Deep inhale, slow exhale. Learning to forgive is a passageway to honesty. And honestly, it's willingness to survive. Free from the sun, I feel like I'll be born again in the dirt. I feel like I am. Liminal spaces, from the formal definition to the cultural aesthetic, demand that we acknowledge our own existence. Where have we been? Where are we going? What was, is, and will be? An additional question that is posed after all that is, how will we position ourselves as we look forward to the future? Will we succumb to fear, hate, despair, apathy? Or will we stand and challenge ourselves to be titans of hope? Hey, thanks for watching the entire thing. Appreciate you a lot. This was a very meaningful piece to me, and so I appreciate that you were able to sit through with me and listen to me talk about something that I really care about. So thanks, appreciate you all. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. We got more cool stuff coming in the future. Video games aren't fun anymore, part 2 coming soon. Surely, surely it'll happen soon. All right, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.